And it's wonderful to see the growth and amazing development of this temple over those years. And so I'm very grateful to be here, but as Reverend Harada just mentioned, today is Gotae, you know, the ceremony or service to acknowledge and celebrate the birth of the founder of your tradition, of this temple's tradition, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, namely Shinran. And so, and as he said, it's kind of an odd thing to have a Zen Buddhist priest talk about, you know, or just appear on a day when we are meant to be talking about the birth of your tradition. And so I won't pretend to speak about Shinran in a way that would be worthy of this particular temple. But I will say a few words along the way that I hope will tie into the idea of birthing a new tradition, birthing a Buddhism and a Buddhist path for yourself, and a few reflections on Shinran as well. But you know, I am a Zen priest, so I need to speak from the tradition I come. And so I wanted to talk today about a set of verses. Today's Dharma message is going to be based on a set of 4 lines, some verses in a text that Shinran's contemporary, Dogen, the founder of my particular school of Buddhism, they were contemporaries. You know, they lived roughly the same time. Dogen from 1200 to 1253, and Shinran from 1173 to 1262. So they had rough. Shinran lived longer, but they lived in the same era, and they were both young monks. You know, they entered the Buddhist path when they were young. They both lost parents when they were quite young. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Shinran was probably only like 9 years old, and Dogen was even younger, 7, when he lost his mother. And I think that loss of parents at a young age was what, you know, entered them into the path of Buddhism, and both of them were ordained in the same tradition called Tendai Buddhism. And they both trained at the same mountain, Mount Hiei, the headquarters of the Tendai tradition, right, you know, in Kyoto. And both of them were Kyoto-born, you know, area born and bred. And so that seemed natural. And the other thing that ties the person I'm going to talk about in a moment, Dogen, with today's birth of Shinran is that both Shinran and Dogen, although they were in the same tradition of Buddhism called Tendai Buddhism as monks, and trained for many years at the headquarters, I think Shinran for 20 years, they both had a crisis of faith, a crisis of like, what is Buddhism all about? They trained for all these years on this mountain. They learned many different forms of teachings of the Buddha, but they both had this fundamental question that drove them to go slightly different directions and actually leave Mount Hiei, leave Tendai Buddhism, and discover something else and actually become founders of new forms of Buddhism in Japan. In Shinran's case, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. In Dogen's case, the founder of Japanese forms of Soto Zen Buddhism. Shinran's question was, you know, he trained for so long, he studied all these texts, he did all the different practices, and he wanted to really figure out how it was possible to attain liberation, to attain enlightenment, to attain awakening, when it seemed so implausible for the average person, including himself. He really was like honest with himself about what he could and couldn't do, and he couldn't quite break through in his Buddhist training on that mountain, and he was dissatisfied. He comes off the mountain. I believe he goes to Rokakudo, and he enters this 100-day meditation period, And I think on the 95th day, he does have a breakthrough where he comes to realize that his kind of self-driven efforts to try to attain awakening is somehow inadequate. And that, in fact, it was the release of that self-driven effort and the receiving of the Buddha's effort, the Buddha's power, that would allow him to really fully enter the Buddhist path. For Dogen, it was a similar kind of thing. He on Mount Hiei, they taught that everybody has Buddha nature. Like kind of what we did with the kids this morning, right? We said we're now Namukieho, Namukieho Butsu, Namukieho, like entering the Buddhist, taking the refuge, the precept. You enter the path, but then you learn like you have Buddha nature already inside of you. And Dogen's question on the mountain was, well, if we have Buddha nature already there, why do we need to practice anything? It's kind of like Shinran's question. What do we need to practice? What does it mean? And I think both of them came to the conclusion that you can't attain enlightenment or awakening or liberation, freedom, by doing something yourself. But Dogen's answer was, you don't practice Buddhism or train meditation and do all these things to get enlightenment, but rather because you have enlightenment, that's why you'd practice. So he kind of flipped the equation. And so he's able to do that also, like Shinran, only when he leaves Mount Hiei. In his case, he goes all the way to China and studies there under a certain teacher. And that teacher uttered a certain phrase to him, Shinjin Datsuraku, in the Japanese way of saying it, the dropping off of body and mind. And that's what I want to focus on now and talk about in my Dharma message this morning, is that phrase and where it appears in this 4-verse set of lines that I want to share with you this morning. I won't talk about with the English session, so I'm not going to. Usually I have to preach in Japanese. I'm going to just talk about do it in English today. But the 4 lines that I want to talk about come from Zen Master Dogen's text called the Genjo Koan. The Genjo Koan. And I'll explain that in a moment. But the 4 lines are this. He says, to study the Buddha way, meaning to study Buddhism, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. Okay, that's line 1. Then he says, to study the self is to forget the self. Line 2. Then line 3 says, to forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. I'll explain that more in a moment. And then the last line is, when you are actualized by the 10,000 things, the body and mind of oneself and the body and mind of others drop off, and no trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So those are the 4 lines. And I want to talk about them in turn. Now, before I do, I wanted to say this is a set of lines that I first encountered. I think I was 16 years old. I was, as Reverend Harada said, I was living in Tokyo, Japan at the time. I lived for 2 years in England, but other than that, I was born and I was kind of raised in Japan. And the reason I had to go to England was my British father. I was 12 years old, and he was so worried that my English was so bad that I got sent to a British boarding school until I could prove that I could handle English. But, the first time I went to England, I think I was 7 years old. Up until then, I only grew up in Japan, and my mom would only speak Japanese to me, and us kids would always speak back, in Japanese, and our neighbors and kids, everything's in Japanese. So, although I also began going to international school to learn some English and whatnot, I felt Japanese, but if you kind of take a look at me, I don't look that Japanese, and I have a name like Duncan Williams. Right? So I never quite fit in, in Japan. But I always felt kind of Japanese, but like I never quite fit in. But I thought, okay, I was 7 years old. We take our first family trip to the UK. We land in Heathrow and go to London, the Strand Palace Hotels, right on the main, in the Strand. And so I'm like, finally, I'm going to fit right in. And apparently that first evening when we checked into the hotel on the 7th floor, we were opening the door to the room, and my parents were like, Duncan, where are your shoes? And apparently I had left them in the lobby. Like, in a Japanese ryokan or inn, you're supposed to take your shoes off before you go in. So that's kind of when I knew, like, okay, I'm not British either. And so when you grow up like that, my mom came from a very Buddhist family, and my father's British, so Anglican, right? Church of England. So we would also on Sundays go to St. Albans Church in Tokyo. So I attended Christian church as well as Buddha. And so I grew up kind of like speaking English and Japanese and somewhat aware of British, or Western culture, but I kind of grew up in Japanese culture and then Buddhist and Christian, So one of the things that happens when you grow up like that, I think, is at some point in your life you say, like, who am I? Am I British? Am I Japanese? Am I Buddhist? Am I like, you start wondering and questioning your identity. And so when I was 16, I came on this first line, this text, and this sentence that said, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. That made some sense to me at that time. That to have a religious or spiritual life, one needed to investigate the question of who am I? What is this? How do I fit into this universe? And that's actually a really important fundamental question to engaging the Buddhist path, to opening up the Buddhist way. And so I would go on. I think I was probably 19 when I first, I as Reverend Harada said, at 17 I came to the United States. I started going to college. I was up in Portland, Oregon, Reed College. And I went to college, but I also spent a year of college living at a Zen temple. And I started to really become interested in Buddhism, this tradition that sometimes is dubbed the middle path, Chudo in Japanese. Right? And that was very attractive to me, this idea that there was a form of religion that said that you can kind of be in the middle. That something about the in-between spaces between various extremes, various identities, is where you might discover something. That the Buddha taught that yourself, we think of ourselves as something solid, but that the Buddha taught everything is not so solid. It's fluid, it's changeable, it's impermanent. And that the Buddha taught that it's not like you have this one thing that's like the same forever, but it's also, not disconnected from everything else. It's in fact utterly interconnected with everything else. That was a very interesting idea for me, that the self was therefore, they use the word empty. It sounds kind of negative, but it's actually not. It just means you're free. It means yourself is interrelated with everything else and subject to evolving. And it also meant, for me as a young man, trying to figure out my identity, it meant that I didn't have to choose between my mom and my dad, right? It meant that I could embrace everything. Sometimes, when I'm with my Japanese relatives, I'd act very Japanese. My wife, even today, she makes fun of me, like I'm on a call to somebody in Tokyo, and then I'm speaking Japanese, and I'm apparently bowing on my cell phone. And my wife is Korean American. She's like, they can't see you, And I'm like, I'm sure they can feel it, So, sometimes you enter that kind of context, and then other times you're in when I'm in the UK, I'm definitely a different kind of person, and that's okay. You can code switch, you can speak different languages, you can bring out different aspects of yourself, and that's when we can accept all of that, there's some freedom in that. And I think that's what it meant for me to learn that Buddhism has a vision of the self that's worth investigating. So that's line number one. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. But let's go to this line two. It's an odd statement, the next thing he says, Dogen. He says, to study the self is to forget the self. What? What does that mean? And I always I've been investigating, how do you translate that sentence well? And literally it does mean wasururu in the classical Japanese, to forget the self. But I think it actually means something more like to release or to let go of the conception of the self that you may have, right? To forget the self, to let go of one's own idea of oneself. Because when you do that, you open up yourself. So the word emptiness I always feel like it's more like openness. You open up to the true reality of yourself. I remember when I was, I had just finished college and I had done a study, Buddhist studies as my undergraduate major, and I was thinking of going on to graduate school. But in between, I became a monk, a Buddhist priest. But right before that, all these summers, I would go back to Japan and I would talk to the person that would become my teacher, and he would always ask me. He was a Zen teacher, so you never knew when he was talking to you whether he was engaging in some special Zen dialogue or whether he was just talking. But anyway, one day I kept on saying I'd like to explore Buddhism more deeply. I'd like to become a Buddhist priest. And every year he'd always be like, no, or you're stupid, or what do you know, or And then one year he goes, and I knew he was asking in the Zen kind of way. He goes, do you even know what it means to become a Buddhist priest? So this is just a little note. By the way, when you have a Zen question like that, you have to put the ball in the other court. So I was like, no, I don't know. Please tell me. Because then he has to tell, And then he said, when you become a Buddhist priest and you put on robes, the moment you put on the robes, it means, can I help you? And so you have to let go of yourself, right? He said, when other people are on holiday, like New Year's or Obon, or it's the busiest time at a Buddhist temple. Or if you become a Buddhist priest, it's not like you have times when you can say to your parishioners, if somebody has a crisis and it's 11 p.m. at night and they give you a call and you're their spiritual, mentor, you can't just say, I'm sorry, the temple closed a certain hour. I'm not going to talk to you. Call again tomorrow. You have to, so he was like, when you become a Buddhist priest, you will have no more holidays. Then he asked, and again, Zen question. He's like, are you still interested in becoming a Buddhist priest? So I said, yes, I'd like to become a Buddhist priest, even with that. And then he said the following. He said, then you have to make every day a holiday. It was interesting. This is he could speak some English, and this part he said it in English. And I've always felt it had two meanings. The English word holiday, holy day, sacred day, a day of practice. Of course, we come here on a day like Gotae. We come here on Sundays. We set aside a certain day of the week to consider holy, to consider a time to reflect. But he's saying when you become a Zen priest, every day has to be a holy day, right? But the other meaning was, you're going to be so busy in your life, you know, there's no time for you to say, this is my time, me. But you have to have an attitude as if every day is one big relaxing holiday. However busy you are, you have to have the mindset as if it's a big, huge holiday. So that's what I got. I mean, I was only 19, 20 years old, so what do I know? You know, but those words have always resonated with me over time because I have become very busy, and but there's something about the second line, to study the Buddha way is to forget the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To study the self is to let go, is to release. And release into what, though? And that's the third line. To forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. In classical Japanese and Chinese literature, when they say the word 10,000, it just means everything. It just means a lot. It's a big number, right? Bambutsu, 10,000 things, everything. To when you release yourself, when you let go of your body and mind, what Dogen heard when he went to China and learned from that teacher, he said, drop off your body and mind, right? And when he heard that, something happened to him. And there's some recognition that when you can release yourself, you become actualized, or you become made up of the 10,000 things, everything. Now that seems a little bit odd as an initial statement, but if you think about it, it's literally true. This morning, I was in the area a little bit early, so I went to a nearby cafe, and I was having some coffee, and I was having some eggs and whatever, and I was like, I would not be sustained. I would not be alive without, some chickens that made the egg. And those chickens wouldn't be alive if there weren't some feed that they ate, that some farmer perhaps in the grew. And that farmer wouldn't exist. They didn't have a grandmother. That wheat wouldn't exist without the sun, without rain. And so everything in the universe makes up one thing, and that one thing that I may have eaten this morning is sustaining me, is giving me life. We can only have gratitude to the 10,000 things. So when we realize and let go of our conception of the self as if it were contained, autonomous, independent, and unchanging, but when we realize and let go of that, to realize that we are constantly changing, constantly interrelated, not independent but interdependent with everything else, then we actually have some gratitude about our life, how precious and amazing it is that we are alive, and how everything in the universe conspires to keep us alive. So there's this, I think, image in the Buddhist tradition. It's called the jewel net of Indra. It's a beautiful image about how the world is constructed. They say the Indian god Indra created this web, a net that extends infinitely in every direction. But if you think about a net, it's kind of like a tennis court net, like if you look at a net carefully, there's these little knots in them. And that in each knot, in the Buddhist image, there's a jewel that's carved in such a way that it's like a beautiful mirror. And so therefore, when you look at one jewel in one node of a net, you can see, because it's a mirror, you can see everything else in this net. Everything else meaning the 10,000 things in one thing, right? That breakfast that I ate, you can see everything, right? Each one of us is like a jewel in that net. I think this morning we chanted or read the golden chain, right? Each There's a chain out there. We're a link in that chain, right? So that's what you get to see when you can let go of yourself. Shinran and Dogen both let go, right? They were on this mountain. They were told you have to train in a certain way, put this kind of effort in, and then you're going to get enlightenment. But they came to some kind of limit to that way of thinking. And what they realized is it isn't about self-effort, but actually about when you let go of that self, that there's something you see. And I think Dogen's saying what you see is that you're actualized by the 10,000 things. And so let me conclude, let me get to that final line, the fourth line. When you're actualized by the 10,000 things, Dogen says, you drop off your own body and mind, and also the body and mind of everybody else, because we're in this net. And then he says, and when you do that, there is no trace of enlightenment. No trace of enlightenment remains, and that no trace continues endlessly. So it's not about doing something as Buddhists to get something, right? Or, I mean, that's okay. That's an okay way of thinking too. Like sometimes we say, like, you know, we practice meditation so that we can get a little bit more calm or focus or concentration, or we can see something. It's okay to think about it that way because that's also true, right? But ultimately, it's not so true. Ultimately, what we get is actually when we release and let go, then we actually can see something really important. And when we see that something that's very important, it's something that actually we can't hold on to. No trace of enlightenment remains, meaning if we try to grasp it, if we try to hold on to something where we think we have an insight and we hold on to it, that's actually not it. It's actually when we let go of that too, that we come to realize that Buddhist training continues endlessly without a holiday. So on this day, Gotae, when we celebrate the birth of Shinran, the birth of a tradition where he said, look, there's a certain value to doing some effort, you know, but the ultimate path of Buddhism opens up to us when we can let go of that. And what comes to us is often a little bit mysterious, right? But it's something to do with us letting go so that the Buddha can come forth. And that kind of Buddha coming forth is not something that can be tied to one day, tied to one moment, tied to some special enlightenment, but it's something that actually, as that last line says, is of no trace, and that this no trace continues endlessly. So on this day, when we celebrate Shinran's birthday, it is a day. It is worth remembering. But it's also worth remembering that every day can be a birthday of a path opening to Buddhist life, and everybody has a question. I mentioned Dogen and Shinran had a question that drove their practice, right? And that these 4 lines of Dogen come from a text called the Genjo Koan. So a lot of people, you know, koans and Zen, like some kind of riddle that has a Buddhist teaching in it somewhere, that kind of thing. That's one way to think about a koan. But the way Dogen's thinking about it, he uses the word Genjo. Gen means to appear, something appears. And Jo means to become or to actualize. So it means to actualize the koan, to actualize the question, to actualize the Buddhist teaching is something that's not found necessarily in some clever riddle of a classical Chinese text, but it exists in our own lives. Dogen had his question. Shinran had his. I invite all of us to seek our question that's going to open up a ceaseless practice of the Buddhist path. Namamiros.